The rain on Hyperion 4 was a constant, whispering dirge, a silver-gray curtain that had fallen for 300 years and showed no signs of stopping. It wasn't water, but a fine, silicate dust that misted down from a perpetually overcast sky, coating the black volcanic rock in a shimmering film and turning the valleys into rivers of slow-moving glass. It was on this forgotten world, in a low-slung ferrocrete bunker sunk halfway into a mountainside, that General Elias Thorne had come to die. He hadn't succeeded yet, but not for lack of trying. The local fauna, silicon-based predators that hunted by vibration, had tried to get him. The planet's corrosive atmosphere had tried to get him a bottle of 23rd century Aldebaran whiskey, potent enough to strip paint from a frigate's hull, was currently making its best effort. Thorne sat in a worn leather chair, the scarred knuckles of one hand wrapped around a heavy crystal tumbler, and watched the gray rain through a reinforced plasteel window. His face was a roadmap of forgotten wars and hard decisions, a landscape of wrinkles and scars dominated by a pair of pale, tired eyes that had seen too many stars go dark. The silence of his self-imposed exile was his only comfort. A thick, heavy blanket he pulled over the ghosts of old campaigns. That blanket was torn to shreds by the sudden, violent roar of atmospheric entry. Thorne didn't flinch, didn't even look up from his drink. He had disconnected his bunker from every comm network in the Terran Confederacy decades ago. No one knew he was here. No one should have been able to find him. The roar became a piercing shriek as a vessel fought the planet's thick, unforgiving air, and then a gut-shaking whump as it landed somewhere on the plateau above his home. For a long moment, the only sound was the familiar whisper of the rain. Then, a new sound intruded, the rhythmic, mechanical crunch of heavy boots on volcanic glass. They were coming for him. He took a slow sip of the whiskey, letting the burn sear a path down his throat. The ghosts in the room, usually content to lurk in the shadows, seemed to lean in with interest. There were only two reasons someone would come all the way to Hyperion 4 for him to kill him, or because the universe was ending. Given the expense of the former, he suspected the latter. The pneumatic hiss of his bunker door sliding open broke the seal on his tomb. A figure stood silhouetted against the gray deluge, flanked by two towering figures in midnight black combat armor, their helmets concealing any hint of humanity. The central figure stepped inside, water-resistant material shedding the silicate rain like a second skin. He was young, his face sharp and unlined, his suit tailored with a precision that spoke of the sterile halls of power on Earth. He radiated an aura of ambition and polished arrogance that Thorne found instantly, profoundly irritating. "General Elias Thorne?" the young man asked, his voice crisp and clear, a politician's voice. "I am Undersecretary Aris Valerius of the Confederate Strategic Council." Thorne swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "Never heard of you. State your business. Then get off my rock. You're scaring the wildlife." Valerius's lips thinned into a tight, practiced smile. He gestured for his guards to remain at the door and approached Thorne's chair, his expensive shoes clicking softly on the metallic floor. He held out a data slate. "I'm here because we need you. General, the Confederacy needs you." Thorne didn't take the slate. "The Confederacy retired me. Said my methods were incompatible with modern galactic diplomacy. That was the official term, I believe. The unofficial one was barbaric war criminal." Valerius didn't miss a beat. Times change. So does the definition of barbarism. He placed the slate on the small table next to Thorne's chair. "We intercepted a transmission, not meant for us. A deep channel, quantum encrypted burst from the Corvus sector. It took our best cryptographers a week to even realize it was a language." He paused for dramatic effect. It was from the Lumina. Thorn finally looked up, his pale eyes narrowing. The Lumina, beings of coherent light, who considered themselves the architects of galactic peace. They inhabited colossal, crystalline city structures they called harmonials, floating in the cores of nebulae. For 5 centuries, since humanity had first stumbled blinking into the wider galaxy, the Lumina and their client races in the Galactic Concord had treated humanity like a particularly virulent disease. Humans were too chaotic, too emotional, their history a litany of self-inflicted violence. Deathworlders, a cancer that had clawed its way out of its planetary cage, unfit to join the enlightened community. The Concord Paris, led by the Lumina's unassailable moral authority, had barred humanity from key trade routes, denied them access to advanced technologies, and quarantined them to a small, contested arm of the galaxy. "What about them?" Thorn grunted, his voice a low rasp. "Did one of their crystal palaces get a scratch in the paint? Send them a strongly worded letter." "Harmonial isn't scratched, General," Valerius said, his voice dropping. "The one at Cygnus X1 has gone dark. It's gone. We believe the transmission we intercepted was its final broadcast." He tapped the slate, and a holographic projection shimmered to life in the dim room. It wasn't a visual feed. It was a waveform, a chaotic, screaming spike of data. Overlaid was a translation, cold and robotic. "It is the Devourer. It does not speak. It does not reason. The song of harmony is broken. The light is consumed." Silence. The recording ended in a burst of static that sounded unnervingly like a shriek. Thorn stared at the fading light of the hologram, the whiskey forgotten in his hand, the Devourer, the chittering horde, the Void Swarm. It had a dozen names, all whispered in the dark corners of the galaxy. It was a ghost story, a legend used to frighten newly spacefaring races into behaving, a biomechanical, insectoid hive mind that moved through the void like a plague of locusts, stripping worlds of all biomass, all energy, all matter, and moving on. They didn't conquer. They didn't negotiate. They simply consumed, turning everything they touched into more of themselves. Most of the Concord's enlightened races didn't even believe the swarm was real. They considered it a primitive superstition, a Terran bogeyman. The Lumina were foremost among the skeptics. They believed the universe trended toward harmony and order. A force of pure chaos like the swarm was, to them, a philosophical impossibility. "So the ghost story is real," Thorn said, his voice flat. He leaned back, the leather of his chair groaning in protest. "And it ate the philosophical purists who didn't believe in it. I could almost call that irony." Valerius's jaw tightened. "The Cygnus Harmonial was home to 12 billion Lumina. We've sent probes. There's nothing there. Just dust. And a fleet of biomechanical ships so vast our long-range sensors registered it as an asteroid field that is now moving. Our projections show its trajectory will take it through the entirety of conquered space." He leaned closer, his politician's mask slipping to reveal a flicker of genuine fear. "And right after that, General, its projected path leads directly to the Sol system." There it was, the real reason they had come to his forgotten corner of the universe. Not to save the Lumina, but to save themselves. Thorn let out a short, harsh laugh that turned into a hacking cough. "Let me see if I have this right. The arrogant bastards who pinned us in, who called us savages and refused to even share medical technology that could have saved millions on the outer colonies, are being eaten by a monster they refuse to believe in. And now you want me to save them as a convenient firewall before that monster gets to us. Have you lost your damn mind? Valerius straightened up, his composure returning. We don't want you to save them. The Confederate Council has already voted. We will not intervene on behalf of the Lumina. It's not our fight. They would never help us. We're pulling all our fleets back to form a defensive perimeter around Earth and the core worlds. It's called the Aegis Initiative. Thorn stared at him. The Aegis Initiative. You politicians really do love your fancy names for cowardice. You're going to build a wall and pray. You'll let the swarm consume the entire Concord, letting it grow stronger, bigger, until it's an unstoppable wave. Then it will hit your Aegis and wash it away like a sandcastle. You're not just abandoning the Lumina, you fool. You're fattening the wolf at the door. It is the strategically sound decision, Valerius snapped, his voice rising. We can't fight a force that wiped out the Lumina. Their fleets were masterpieces of energy projection. Their harmonials were fortresses, and they were annihilated without a trace. What could we possibly do? Our ships are projectile-based, outdated. We'd be throwing our fleets into a meat grinder. Exactly. Thorn slammed his glass down, the crystal cracking under the force. You think like they did? You fight with honor, with predictable strategies and clean energy beams. You're trying to play chess with a tidal wave. You don't fight the swarm with fleets and grand strategy. Well, you don't fight it at all. You poison it. You starve it. You make every world it tries to consume a toxic, radioactive hell that chokes it from the inside out. You use its own nature, its hunger, against it. You fight it like a disease, not an army. He stood up, a towering, weary giant, his shadow engulfing the undersecretary. The Lumina and their Concord were afraid of us because they looked at our history and saw nothing but war. They saw plagues, scorched earth tactics, biological agents, nuclear fire, brother fighting brother for a patch of dirt. They called it savagery. They never understood it was practice. Valerius was silent, his earlier confidence gone, replaced by the wary look of a man who had just realized he'd stepped into the cage of a predator he thought was sedated. The Council believes a defensive posture is our only chance of survival. The Council is a committee of fools who think a war is won on a spreadsheet. Thorn growled. They want to save lives, a noble goal. But when you face an enemy that wants to consume every last cell of your existence, saving lives is a luxury you can't afford. The only way to win is to be willing to sacrifice more than your enemy can imagine. You have to become the monster that even other monsters are afraid of. He walked over to a tarnished metal cabinet in the corner of the room and pulled out a bottle, pouring another measure of the Aldebaran whiskey into his cracked glass. So, why are you really here? Valerius, the Council has a plan, stupid as it is. They don't need me for that. You could have brought any decorated fleet admiral out of retirement to command your little wall of ships. But you came for me. You came for the barbaric war criminal. Why? The undersecretary took a deep breath, his gaze flicking toward the two armored guards at the door. Because not everyone on the Council agrees with the Aegis Initiative. A small but unsanctioned faction believes you are right. They believe that waiting is a death sentence. They sent me. This is not an official Confederate mission. If we fail, you will be branded a traitor, and I will be erased from the records. Thorn took a long, slow drink. He could feel the gears of his old life grinding back into motion, the cold, familiar calculus of war settling over him. He hated it. He had come here to be left alone, to let the universe burn without him. But the universe, it seemed, had other plans. It was one thing for the gleaming, arrogant Lumina to fall. It was another for humanity to cower behind a wall, waiting for the inevitable, pretending it was a strategy. They were Deathworlders. They didn't hide from the dark. They were the thing that hunted in it. "You have no fleet to give me," Thorn stated. "Not a question. The Council controls the military." "Not entirely," Valerius said, a new sharper edge to his voice. He seemed to have found his footing again. "The Council controls the official fleets. The shiny new dreadnoughts and carriers they show off at diplomatic parades, but they've always been afraid of the past. Your past." "General." Thorn stopped, the glass halfway to his lips. He knew what Valerius was talking about. "They exist in a legal gray area, officially decommissioned after the Outer Rim rebellions, but too expensive and too useful to ever truly be dismantled. They are mothballed, scattered across the forgotten edges of our territory, obsolete, crewed by skeletons and specters, ignored by the official record. They wouldn't give them to me," Thorn said. "The Council would sooner scuttle them." "The Council doesn't need to know," Valerius countered. "My faction has the access codes. We have the recall protocols for the crews. Old veterans, mostly, men and women like you, put out to pasture because their way of war was too direct. They are loyal to the idea of victory, not to a committee." Thorn stared out the window at the endless gray rain. The Vindicator, the Reaper, the Leviathan, names from a darker time. Ships built not for exploration or defense, but for extermination. Vessels that carried planet-cracking torpedoes and viral agents. They weren't warships. They were instruments of genocide, designed by a desperate species that had learned its lessons in a bloody, unforgiving crucible. Using them would mean becoming the very thing the Lumina had always accused them of being, but it might be the only way to survive. "One condition," Thorn said, turning back to face the young politician. "I want full, autonomous command. No oversight, no committee, no check-ins. You point me at the swarm, and you get out of my way. My methods will not be clean, and my casualty reports will not be pretty. You will not like what I have to do, but you will live." Valerius met his hard gaze without flinching. For the first time, Thorn saw a glimmer of steel beneath the polished exterior. "The faction agrees. They know what they are asking of you, what they are unleashing. You will have your war, General." Elias Thorn drained his glass, the fiery liquid a familiar promise of destruction. "Fine," he rasped. "Get your pilot ready. It's time to go wake the dead." The shuttle that carried them from the surface of Hyperion 4 was a sterile, functional thing, a far cry from the opulent diplomatic couriers Valerius was clearly accustomed to. It was a military surplus transport, stripped of anything that wasn't essential for getting from a gravity well to orbit, and it smelled faintly of hydraulic fluid and nervous sweat. Thorn settled into a crash seat. The simple act of strapping himself in a motion as familiar and ingrained as breathing. He ignored Valerius, who sat opposite him, fidgeting with the settings on his personal data slate, his face illuminated by its cold, blue light. The young undersecretary was a man who lived in a world of data streams and projections, of carefully worded memos and political calculus. Out here, in the raw, physical reality of a ship-breaking atmosphere, he was a passenger. Thorn was home. They ascended through the perpetual gray rain, the silicate dust streaking against the viewport like tears, until they broke through the cloud layer into the stunning, silent clarity of space. Hyperion 4 was a dirty pearl below them, swaddled in its gray shroud. Above, the unfamiliar stars of this galactic arm burned with a cold, indifferent fire. The destination is classified as Sector 734, designation Tartarus, Valerius said, but breaking the silence. It's a rogue nebula, tidally locked between two black holes. The gravitational distortions make conventional warp travel impossible and long-range scans a nightmare. The Confederacy used it as a dumping ground for its mistakes, problematic technologies, failed experiments, and ships. Thorn grunted, his gaze fixed on the starfield. So, we're going to the junkyard. Valerius winced at the term. It's a secure, deep storage facility. The Ghost Fleet, as the crews used to call it, is tethered within the nebula's densest dust cloud. Minimal power, automated maintenance drones keeping the worst of the decay at bay. It's been untouched for 50 years. For the next several hours, the shuttle ran silent, its stealth systems engaged as it made a series of micro-jumps, stitching a path through Confederate-patrolled space like a needle through black velvet. Valerius handled the coded transmissions, feeding their ghost signature into the network, making them appear as a stray asteroid or a sensor glitch. Thorn watched, saying nothing. He recognized the dance, the lies and half-truths, the cloaks and daggers required to move against your own. It was politics. The one battlefield he'd never mastered, the one he'd always despised. He was a hammer, and every problem looked like a nail. Men like Valerius saw the world as a web, and they were the spider, pulling on 1,000 different threads. They needed each other, the hammer and the spider, and they both knew it. Their final jump was jarring, a lurch that threw the shuttle out of warp into the churning heart of the Tartarus Nebula. The view outside the port changed from the sharp pinpricks of distant stars to a rolling, chaotic sea of incandescent gas. Vast curtains of purple and crimson hydrogen lit from within by the radiation of young, unstable stars, and hanging in that cosmic fog, like leviathans sleeping in the deep, were the ships, the Ghost Fleet. They weren't arranged in neat, orderly lines like the active Navy. They were chained to jagged asteroids, tethered in a loose, haphazard sphere, their hulls the color of rust and shadow, coated in a half-century of cosmic dust. They were ugly. Unlike the sleek, almost organic designs of the Concord or the clean, efficient lines of the modern Confederate fleet, these ships were brutalist monstrosities. They were wedges and blades and fists of armored metal, bristling with weapon emplacements that had no business on a sane vessel. There were spinal-mounted railguns the length of a cruiser, missile pods that scarred the hull like tumors, and strange, disc-like emitters whose purpose Thorn knew all too well. These were not ships of diplomacy. They were butcher's tools, forged in the fires of desperation. By the stars, Valerius whispered, his face pale as he stared at the silent Armada. The records did not do them justice. Thorn's gaze swept over the sleeping giants, and for the first time in decades, something stirred in him, a cold, dark thing that had been lying dormant. It was the thrill of command, the weight of terrible, absolute power. His eyes found one ship in particular, larger than the others, a brutal arrowhead of a vessel moored to the largest asteroid in the cluster. Even under its shroud of dust, its lines were unmistakable, as familiar to him as the scars on his own hands. "There," he said, his voice a low rumble. "That one. The Charon." Docking with the dead ship was an eerie process. Valerius's codes coaxed the dormant systems to life, opening a single hangar bay with a groan of protesting metal. As their shuttle settled onto the deck, emergency lights flickered on, casting long, dancing shadows down the cavernous space. The air that cycled in was stale, tasting of cold metal and ozone. Thorn was the first one out, his heavy boots echoing in the profound silence. He ran a hand along the hull of a parked assault lander, his fingers coming away gray with dust. This was his ship, his tomb. He had commanded the Karen for the final, bloody years of the Outer Rim rebellions, the scythe campaigns that had broken the secessionists, but had also branded him a monster. He walked from the hangar into the main concourse, Valerius and his 2 guards following like nervous acolytes in the wake of a grim deity. Power was minimal, the corridors lit only by the intermittent red strobes of the emergency lighting. They took a lift to the bridge, a silent, claustrophobic ride through the vessel's heart. The bridge of the Karen was not the sterile, holographic command center of a modern warship. It was a pit, a multi-tiered amphitheater of hardened steel and armored glass, designed to function even with half of it exposed to hard vacuum. At its center, bolted directly to the deck, was the command chair. His chair. Thorn settled into it, the worn material groaning faintly. A perfect fit even after all these years. He placed his hands on the armrests, his fingers finding the familiar worn grooves. He felt the ship around him, a sleeping beast waiting for a command. "Begin the reactivation sequence," Thorn ordered, his voice resonating with an authority he hadn't used in decades. Valerius nodded, apping commands into his slate, feeding the ship's master computer the codes it needed to awaken from its long slumber. A low hum started deep within the vessel's belly, the sound of ancient, powerful machinery stirring. Lights began to flicker on across the bridge consoles, one by one, chasing the shadows away. System status reports scrolled across the main view screen, a litany of amber and red warnings. Life support, stable but at minimal capacity. Internal gravity, offline. Main reactor, cold. "The reactor needs a manual startup," Valerius said, reading from his slate. "The automated safeties are absolute. It requires a prime engineer's command codes." As if on cue, a grating voice echoed from the bridge's internal comm speaker. "You dragged him all the way out here, and you didn't think to bring me along, amateurs." A hatch at the rear of the bridge hissed open, and a woman emerged. She was as old as Thorn, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, her face a mask of cynical disapproval. She wore a stained engineer's jumpsuit and carried a heavy diagnostic kit as if it were a part of her. "Chief Engineer Jana Riley," Thorn said, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "Still complaining, I see." Riley snorted, her eyes, sharp and intelligent, scanning the bridge. "And you're still sitting in that chair like you own the universe. Someone has to keep your ego from overloading the power grid, Elias. Now, are we going to get this rust bucket running, or are you planning on fighting the great whatever it is with harsh language?" She brushed past Valerius without a glance, plugging her kit into the main engineering console. Her fingers, gnarled and stained with grease, flew across the interface with a practiced, intimate grace. "The fusion core is cold, but the containment fields are holding. Give me an hour, and I'll give you a heartbeat." While Riley worked her magic in the guts of the ship, the rest of the crew began to arrive. They came in a trickle of battered, unmarked freighters and deep space couriers, all part of Valerius's clandestine network. They were the ghosts Thorn was sent to awaken. They filed onto the bridge of the Karen, not with the crisp salutes of the Confederate Navy, but with quiet nods and knowing looks. They were old soldiers, Men and women whose faces bore the same hard-won maps as Thorn's. They were the veterans of Vega 5, the survivors of the Orion Siege, the butchers of the Scythe campaigns. They were the forgotten, the disgraced, the ones who had been deemed too brutal for a civilized galaxy. A tall but gaunt man with a prosthetic arm and a calm, bitty, unnerving demeanor took the XO station to Thorn's left. "Kalen Reed," he said, his voice a quiet counterpoint to Thorn's gravelly tone. "It's been a long time, General. Good to have you back." "Kale," Thorn replied. One by one, they took their stations, the bridge slowly coming to life, filling with the low murmur of professionals going about their work. They needed no orders, no orientation. They knew the ship, and the ship knew them. An hour later, a deep, powerful thrum resonated through the deck plates as the main reactor finally achieved stable fusion. The amber and red lights on the status board turned a steady, reassuring green. The bridge lighting switched from the frantic red strobes to a calm, operational blue. The Karen was alive. "Weapons systems online," Reed reported, his voice calm. "Primary railgun is charging. Torpedo bays are ready. The other systems are standing by." The other systems were the reason the Karen and its sister ships had been buried out here. Not the kinetic weapons or the plasma cannons, but the gravitic shears that could tear a ship apart atom by atom. The resonance torpedoes that could liquefy the crew inside a sealed hull. The viral agents that could turn a planet's biosphere into gray goo. They were weapons of absolute horror. "The rest of the fleet is still cold," Valerius said, stepping forward. "It will take weeks to get them all crewed and operational." "We don't have weeks," Thorn said, his gaze fixed on the main view screen, which now showed the swirling chaos of the nebula outside. "We have today." As he spoke, a proximity alert blared through the bridge. "Unidentified contact," the tactical officer called out. "Small vessel, Confederate signature. It's an Aegis patrol drone, long-range scout class. It's hailing us." On the screen, a text block appeared. Stark and official. "Unidentified vessel. You are in a restricted military sector. Identify yourself immediately or you will be fired upon." Valerius looked at Thorn, his face tight with alarm. "If it reports back, the Council will know we're here. They'll send a fleet to shut us down before we've even begun." Thorn's face was unreadable, carved from stone. He leaned forward slightly, his presence seeming to fill the entire bridge. For 50 years, the Confederacy had kept him on a leash, retired him, buried his legacy. They had chosen to cower behind a wall while the galaxy burned. They had made their choice. Now he would make his. He didn't look at the hailing message. He didn't look at Valerius. He looked at Kalen Reed. "XO," Thorn said, his voice low and cold, leaving no room for argument. "Target the drone. Use a resonance torpedo. I want it gone. No debris, no energy signature, no evidence. Erase it." Reed simply nodded. "Aye, General." At the weapons console, the officer's hands moved with quiet efficiency. A soft chime indicated a lock. Torpedo away. There was no explosion, no flash of light. On the screen, the drone's icon simply vanished. One moment it was there, a symbol of the official, sanctioned order. The next, it was gone, as if it had never existed. A profound silence fell over the bridge. Valerius stared at the empty space on the screen, his expression a mixture of horror and awe. They had just committed their first act of treason. They had crossed the line. Elias Thorne leaned back in his command chair, the thrum of his awakened warship a familiar song in his bones. He looked out at the graveyard of sleeping monsters waiting in the Nebula. "Riley," he broadcast over the ship-wide comm, his voice a promise of fire and ruin. "Begin the fleet-wide activation sequence. It's time to wake the rest of them." And the order to awaken the fleet did not result in a triumphant surge of power, but in a slow, agonizing groan that echoed across the Tartarus Nebula. It was the sound of a mechanical resurrection on a planetary scale, a choir of groaning metal and protesting servos. From the bridge of the Charon, Thorn watched as, one by one, the ghost ships lit up. First, a flicker of emergency strobes, then the steady, sullen glow of internal lighting, turning the constellation of coffins into a swarm of angry fireflies against the swirling crimson and violet gases. Power surged from the Charon's newly reawakened reactor, transmitted via high-energy maser beams that lanced through the void, jump-starting the cold fusion cores of its brethren. On each ship, skeleton crews of engineers, woken from cryo-sleep or delivered by Valerius's ghost transports, worked frantically, coaxing ancient machinery back to life. These were Jana Riley's people, men and women who spoke the language of stressed metal and failing conduits, who could diagnose a power cascade by the vibrations in the deck plates. For 3 days, the Nebula was filled with this mechanical symphony of rebirth, and with the ships came the crews. They were not the fresh-faced cadets of the Confederate Academy. They were a legion of the discarded, men with prosthetic limbs that were 2 generations out of date, women with vat-grown skin grafts covering old plasma burns, pilots whose reaction times were now augmented by twitchy, unreliable cybernetics. Their faces were hard, their eyes holding the quiet, haunted look of people who had seen the absolute worst of what the galaxy had to offer and had been the instrument of it. They moved with a grim economy of motion, finding their old stations, running diagnostics, and prepping weapon systems with a muscle memory that 50 years of forced peace had not managed to erase. They were Thorn's people, the human cost of the victories that had allowed the Confederacy to pretend it was civilized. On the 4th day, Thorn convened his council of war. It was not held in a polished briefing room, but on the open flag deck of the Charon's bridge, surrounded by the quiet hum of a fully operational warship. He stood before a holographic display of the Corvus sector, a swirling map of stars and tactical overlays. With him were Riley, her face smudged with grease but her eyes bright with satisfaction. Kalen Reed, his calm demeanor a rock in the sea of controlled chaos, and a handful of newly instated ship captains, their expressions grim and expectant. Aris Valerius stood slightly apart from them, his immaculate suit a stark contrast to the worn-down military fatigues of the others. He looked like a man who had wandered into the wrong room and was only now realizing it was a cage full of wolves. "The fleet is at 70% operational capacity," Reed began, his voice a low monotone. 38 vessels are combat ready. The Behemoth, the Tiamat, and the Juggernaut are online. Their spinal mounts are charging. The rest of the fleet is armed and mobile. We have enough fuel and munitions for one major engagement." Thorn nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. "There will be no major engagement. Not yet." He gestured to the star chart, to a pulsing red icon that marked the Cygnus X1 system. "This is where the Lumina died. This is where the Swarm fed. And this," he said, his voice dropping, "is where we will go first." Valerius stepped forward, his face a mask of disbelief. "General, that is the heart of the incursion. To go there now would be suicide. Our objective should be to establish a defensive line, to fortify the conquered worlds that lie in the Swarm's path." Thorn turned his head slowly, pinning the undersecretary with a gaze as cold and heavy as a glacier. "Your objective, Mr. Valerius, is to observe. My objective is to win. The Aegis initiative you so despise is a defensive line. It is a wall, and a wall is just something an enemy learns to climb, and the Concord worlds are already dead, and they are bait in a trap that has already sprung, and to try and save them would be to throw our ships, our only real weapon, into the grinder for nothing. We would die for a noble gesture. But we can't simply let them be consumed," Valerius protested, his voice laced with genuine horror. "There are trillions of lives that their own leadership left defenseless because they refuse to believe in monsters." Thorn cut in, his voice like grinding stone. "I will not sacrifice a single human ship for a species that quarantined us for our savagery, while their own enlightened passivity led them to extinction. Their fate is a lesson, not a cause." He turned back to the map. "The swarm is not an army. It is a biological organism. It has instincts. It has needs. It needs to feed, to replicate, to expand. It just consumed a star system's worth of energy and matter from the Lumina. It will be sated, gestating, analyzing what it has consumed and adapting. This is our window, not to attack, but to learn." He zoomed the map in on the Cygnus system. "We will take a small task force, led by the Karen, and we will perform a necropsy on a dead god. I want to know everything. What are their ship compositions? What are their energy signatures? How do they communicate? What did they leave behind? We will sift through the ashes of the Lumina, and we will find a weakness. We will find the disease we can introduce into their system." "And the rest of the fleet?" asked the captain of the Behemoth, a craggy-faced man with a fearsome scar across his throat. "They will not wait here," Thorn said. He indicated a series of uninhabited star systems, rich in heavy metals and radioactive isotopes, that lay just outside the swarm's projected path. "They will go here. They will begin preparations. This is the start of the Scorched Void Doctrine." A chill settled over the bridge. Even the hardened veterans shifted uneasily. The Scorched Void Doctrine was not in any official military textbook. It was a strategy Thorn had developed in the darkest days of the rebellions. It was a policy of strategic denial, taken to its most horrific extreme. It meant identifying a world the enemy needed, and not just conquering it, but destroying its utility, cracking the tectonic plates, poisoning the atmosphere, igniting the magnetosphere. It was turning a planet from a prize into a poison pill. "You can't be serious," Valerius whispered, his face ashen. "You would preemptively destroy entire worlds. Uninhabited worlds, Mr. Valerius." Thorn corrected him, though his tone offered little comfort. "We will mine their moons for every ounce of fissile material. We will convert our industrial fabricators to producing self-replicating toxins. We will turn every nebula into a minefield of gravitic shears. When the swarm arrives, it will not find a feast. It will find a famine. It will find a graveyard we prepared for it. It will choke on every system it tries to swallow. We will starve it. We will poison it. And only then, when it is weakened and desperate, will we descend with the fleet and kill it." It was a strategy of unimaginable brutality, a plan that treated star systems as ammunition and viewed the galaxy itself as a weapon to be wielded. It was the logic of a Death Worlder, where survival was not a negotiation, but a zero-sum game. Valerius looked from Thorn to the faces of the other captains and saw no dissent, no shock. He saw only a grim, quiet understanding. He had come to Hyperion 4 to unleash a monster, and he had succeeded beyond his wildest nightmares. As if to punctuate the gravity of their new reality, A klaxon suddenly blared across the bridge. "Alert!" the tactical officer snapped. "Multiple warp signatures detected at the edge of the Nebula Confederate Registry. It's Battle Group Gamma, 1 Olympus-class carrier, 3 Aegis-class cruisers, and a destroyer escort. They're hailing us." "They found us," Reed stated calmly. "The drone didn't report, so they sent the wolves." Valerius paled. "We have to answer them. We can explain." "Explain what?" Thorn shot back. "That we've stolen a fleet of decommissioned war criminals and are about to commit acts of planetary destruction. They are here to put us down." "Valerius, this is the end of your political solution." "We can't fight them," one of the captains said. "We're not fully operational, and even if we were, they're our own people." "We will not fight them," Thorn agreed. "And we will not be taken." "Riley, how long until the fleet is ready for a coordinated jump?" The chief engineer's voice came over the comm, tinny and strained. "Conventional FTL is a no-go. Elias, the gravitic distortions in this nebula would tear the ships apart before they even entered warp. We'd have to crawl out to the edge on sublight, and they'd catch us in hours." A predatory smile touched Thorn's lips. "Who said anything about conventional?" He turned to Reed. "XO, prepare the fleet for a cascade fold. Prime the chronoton emitters. Slave all navigation systems to the Karen." A new tension filled the bridge, a nervous energy that was a mix of fear and exhilaration. Cascade fold. The technology was another reason the Ghost Fleet had been buried. It wasn't a warp drive that bent space-time. It was a brute force weapon that punched a hole directly through it, creating a momentary, unstable wormhole. It was untraceable, instantaneous, and monumentally dangerous. A miscalculation of a single decimal point in the energy equations could unravel a ship at the subatomic level. Slaving an entire fleet to a single jump was considered suicidal. "General," Reed said, his one human hand resting on his console, "the failure state probability for a fleet-wide fold is over 17%. "Then I suggest your navigators be exceptionally precise today," Thorn replied without a flicker of doubt. "Send Battle Group Gamma a message. One word, run." Outside, the 38 ships of the Ghost Fleet began to change. Strange, glowing pylons extended from their hulls, and a shimmering, violet energy began to crawl across their armored plates. The very fabric of space around them seemed to thin, to warp, as titanic energies were brought to bear. On the bridge of the Karen, the world dissolved into a maelstrom of light and screaming physics. The deck bucked like a living thing, and a sound like tearing reality filled the air. Eris Valerius gripped a console, his knuckles white, certain that these were his last moments. He saw the Confederate battle group on the view screen, saw their confusion turn to alarm as they witnessed the impossible energies being unleashed. Then Thorn's final command cut through the chaos, a voice of absolute, terrifying certainty. "Execute!" And with a silent, violent lurch that felt like the universe turning itself inside out, the Tartarus Nebula became empty once more. The Ghost Fleet was gone. The universe did not so much reappear as slam into them. The Cascade Fold was less a form of travel and more a controlled, fleet-wide seizure. On the bridge of the Karen, the world snapped back into a semblance of reality with a bone-jarring shudder that threw anyone not strapped down to the deck. Alarms shrieked in a dozen different tones, a cacophony of damage reports and system failures. The main view screen was a blizzard of static, and the calm blue operational lighting had been replaced by the frantic, pulsing red of emergency power. Thorn remained anchored in his command chair, his knuckles white on the armrests, his teeth clenched against the violent transition. The sensation was like being flayed and reassembled at the subatomic level, A brutal violation of physics that left a coppery taste of ozone in the air and a lingering sense of vertigo. "Report," he barked, his voice cutting through the din. Kalen Reed was already at his station, his one good hand flying across his console while the other gripped a support strut to steady himself. "We're blind. Main sensors are offline. Navigation is trying to get a star fix. The cascade. It wasn't clean." His voice was as calm as ever, but there was a new, hard edge to it. "Fleet-wide status. Coming in now." Reed's fingers danced. "Signal is choppy." The fold created a subspace echo that's interfering with comms. "I'm getting confirmations. Behemoth is reporting moderate structural damage but is operational. Tiamat, minor casualties. Weapon system cycling. Juggernaut is not responding." A grim silence fell over the bridge, broken only by the shriek of the alarms. "Keep hailing them," Thorne ordered, his jaw tight. "Give me a ship-wide report. Riley, talk to me." Chief Engineer Riley's voice crackled over the comm, laced with static and her usual acidic irritation. "The reactor containment is holding, but just barely. The fold almost shook the damn thing apart. I've had to divert 90% of our power to reinforcing the magnetic bottle. We're running on fumes up here. Elias, give me 3 hours to stabilize, or we're all going to become a very small, very bright nebula." "You have 1 hour," Thorne replied flatly. "Valerius," he said, turning his head. The undersecretary was pulling himself up from the deck, his face a pale shade of green, his immaculate suit now rumpled and stained. He looked at Thorne with wide, accusing eyes. 17% failure state," Valerius managed to choke out. "You knew." "I knew it was a risk," Thorne corrected, his gaze unwavering. "Inaction was a certainty. We have lost 1 ship to save 37. That is a trade I will make every single day. Welcome to the war, Undersecretary." Before Valerius could respond, the tactical officer shouted, "Sir, I'm getting something. Main sensors are back online. Clearing the view screen now." The static dissolved, and the image that coalesced on the screen silenced every alarm, every voice, every frantic thought on the bridge. They had arrived at Cygnus X1, but there was no system here, not anymore, where a vibrant blue star and its orbiting world should have been. There was only a void, a sphere of absolute blackness that seemed to drink the light of the surrounding galaxy. It was surrounded by a halo of debris so vast and dense it resembled the rings of a gas giant, a swirling graveyard of shattered planets, broken moons, and the crystalline dust of the annihilated Lumina Harmonials. The debris field glittered, catching the light of distant stars, a beautiful and obscene testament to a genocide on a scale the human mind could barely comprehend. There was no energy, no radiation, no sign of life, just a profound, chilling silence that seemed to press in on the Charon's hull. This wasn't a battlefield. It was a tomb, a cosmic scar. "My God," Valerius whispered, his earlier anger forgotten, replaced by a deep, soul-shaking horror. They ate the star. They ate everything," Thorne said, revoir, his voice a low growl. He was leaning forward, his eyes scanning the devastation with a cold, analytical intensity. There was no shock on his face, only a grim confirmation. He was looking at the face of his enemy, and it was a face of perfect, absolute hunger. "XO, take the Charon," the Reaper, and the Stalker into the debris field. The rest of the fleet holds position here and stands by for the Juggernaut. I want a full spectrum analysis. Every sensor, every scanner. Sift through this garbage heap. I want to know what they are, and I want to know how they died. For the next 10 hours, the 3 ships moved like sharks through a coral reef of death. They passed through clouds of vaporized rock, navigated fields of shattered crystal that had once been cities of light, and maneuvered around the Titanic. Dead husks of Lumina vessels, and the Lumina ships were not torn apart by explosions. Their crystalline structures had been dissolved, leaving behind ghostly, skeletal frames that crumbled into dust as the Charon's drive wash touched them. Valerius watched from the observation deck, a silent, horrified witness. The data that streamed in was incomprehensible. The swarm had not just consumed the system, they had broken it down to its component elements. They had unmade it. On the bridge, the atmosphere was tense and focused. "We're detecting anomalous energy signatures deep within the field," the science officer reported. "Faint, but coherent. It's not background radiation." "Can you isolate the source?" Thorne demanded. "Negative, sir. The interference from the metallic dust is too high. It's like trying to find a whisper in a foundry. But the energy, it has a biological feel to it. It's rhythmic, like a heartbeat." Thorne's eyes narrowed. "Take us closer." The Charon pushed deeper into the densest part of the ring, its navigational deflectors working overtime to vaporize smaller debris. The rhythmic signal grew stronger, a slow, deep pulse that seemed to thrum in the very bones of the ship. And then they saw it. It was not a ship. It was a moon, a new moon, where none had existed before. It was a sphere of biomechanical matter, 100 kilometers in diameter, a churning, pulsating mass of chitinous plates, writhing cables, and glowing, vascular structures. It was cobbled together from the wreckage of the system, planetary crust fused with the remnants of Lumina ships, all held together by a black, organic resin that seemed to flow and shift like living tar. At its core, a faint, sickly green light pulsed in time with the energy signal. It was a heart, a stomach, a womb. "What is that?" Reed asked, his usual calm finally cracking. "It's a harvester," Thorne said, a strange, grim light out in his eyes. He had read of such things in the fragmented, terrified accounts of the few species who had encountered the swarm and survived, accounts the conquered had dismissed as myth. "It's a mobile factory. It processes everything it consumes, analyzes it, and adapts the swarm's genetic code. It's turning the Luminous technology way, their biology way, everything they were into new weapons, new ships, new monsters." This was the swarm's true terror. It didn't just win, it learned. It evolved. The force that left the system would be stronger, smarter, and more resilient than the one that had arrived. It was now armed with the secrets of the most advanced species in the galaxy. "We need to get closer," Thorne ordered. "I want a tissue sample. I want to know its composition down to the molecule." "General, that thing is broadcasting," the comms officer interrupted. "Not on any frequency I know. It's a psychic resonance. Very low level. It feels like dreaming." Before Thorne could process that, a new alert sounded. "Proximity alarms, multiple small contacts emerging from the harvester's surface. They're fast." On the view screen, the new moon began to shed its skin. Dozens, then hundreds, of smaller biomechanical craft detached themselves from its pulsating surface. They were not sleek fighters, they were jagged, insectoid nightmares, a fusion of crystalline shards from luminous ships and black, chitinous carapaces. They swarmed towards Thorn's small task force like hornets from a disturbed nest. They were waiting, Reed said. It was a trap. Then let's not disappoint them, Thorn snarled. The old fire, the one he had tried to drown in whiskey on Hyperion 4, erupted in his chest. All ships, weapons-free, target those bugs and show them what a real monster looks like. The void erupted. The Charon's main batteries roared, spitting slugs of superheated plasma that vaporized the lead swarm vessels. But for every one they killed, 10 more took its place, their movements erratic, twitchy, unlike any sane pilots. They didn't use energy weapons. They fired streams of corrosive acid that sizzled against the Charon's shields and spat shards of razor-sharp crystal that embedded themselves in the ship's armor. The Reaper and the Stalker, smaller, faster destroyer-class ships, moved to flank them, their point defense cannons filling the space between them with a web of incandescent fire. "Shields at 80%, the tactical officer yelled. "They're trying to swarm us. Get in close. Then let them," Thorn said, his knuckles white. "Target the lead group. Kyle, fire a resonance torpedo." Reed paused for a fraction of a second. "General, at this range, the feedback, fire it," Thorn commanded. Reed nodded grimly. "Firing." A single dark projectile shot from the Charon's belly. It didn't explode. It simply streaked into the middle of the densest formation of swarm fighters and vibrated. A low, subsonic hum filled the bridge, a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight for the spine. Outside, the swarm ships convulsed. The crystalline components of their hulls shattered, and the organic parts turned to jelly. They dissolved, melting into clouds of vapor and lifeless organic sludge without a single flash of light. Valerius, who had rushed back to the bridge, stared in abject horror. He had just witnessed a weapon that killed by sound, that unmade living tissue on a resonant frequency. The sheer, calculated horror of it was beyond anything he had ever imagined. The swarm, however, learned fast. The next wave of fighters split, avoiding bunching together. They began to focus their fire on the smaller, more vulnerable Stalker. Acid and crystal shards tore at its shields, which flickered and died. "The Stalker is taking heavy damage. Divert power from our aft shields to theirs," Thorn ordered. "Riley, I need more power to the main guns. Now. I'm giving you all she's got. Elias." The engineer's voice crackled back. "The engine is redlining. Then let it burn." The battle was a brutal, close-range knife fight. It was not the clean, detached warfare of the modern Navy. It was a brawl. The Charon used its gravitic shears, projecting localized fields of distorted gravity that twisted swarm fighters into pretzels of metal and flesh. The swarm responded by latching onto the Reaper's hull, their metallic legs tearing at the armor, trying to bore their way inside. Thorn was in his element. He was a conductor of a symphony of violence, every order precise, every move calculated for maximum lethality. He saw the patterns, the weaknesses, the moments of opportunity. He felt the rhythm of the battle in his blood. Finally, seeing their smaller vessels failing, a larger shape began to emerge from the Harvester. It was a cruiser-sized bioship, its front a gaping maw lined with crystalline teeth. "That's enough," Thorn said. "We have what we came for." "Sir," Reed asked. The science team managed to tractor in a fragment from one of the first ships we hit. We have our sample. Get us out of here. The three ships disengaged, firing their aft weapons as they pulled back, their engines burning at maximum thrust. The swarm ships pursued, while the larger biocruiser was slow to accelerate, so they cleared the densest part of the debris field. Thorn gave one final order. Target the Harvester's core. Launch our last resonance torpedo. General, Reed said, we don't know what that will do. I know, Thorn said, his eyes glinting in the red light of the bridge. That's why we're doing it. The torpedo shot away, a final parting gift. It struck the pulsating green heart of the biomechanical moon. The effect was not an explosion. The rhythmic pulse faltered. Then it sped up, becoming a rhythmic spasm. A wave of pure psychic energy washed over them. A silent scream of agony and rage that made every crew member on the bridge clutch their heads in pain. The Harvester convulsed, and the swarm ships pursuing them suddenly went dead, tumbling lifelessly in space. Their connection to the hive mind severed. As the Karen prepared to jump, the last thing they saw on the view screen was the Harvester beginning to tear itself apart from the inside. Its own energies turned against it. They had survived. They had their data. But they had also done something far more dangerous. They had wounded the beast, and now, across the silent, unimaginable distances of the void, the swarm was no longer just hungry. It was awake, and it was angry. The jump back to the fleet's rendezvous point was a clean one, a cold and precise fold that deposited the three-ship task force back into the empty space where they had left the others. The contrast between the violent chaos of the Cascade Fold and this smooth, controlled transit was a testament to the skill of the navigators, but it offered little comfort. As the Charon approached the waiting Armada, a single, unavoidable truth hung in the void between them, the empty space where the Juggernaut should have been. The fleet had lost one of its three heaviest hitters, a ship carrying over 5,000 crew, to a 17% probability. It was a stark, brutal reminder of the stakes, a down payment in blood on Thorn's strategy. He ordered the fleet to hold a minute of calm silence, a brief, inadequate memorial for the lost. In the profound quiet of the bridge, the weight of command settled on Thorn not as a mantle of power, but as a shroud. Every life lost from this point forward was his and his alone. The silence was broken by Riley's voice, crackling with a triumphant, manic energy from the science bay. Elias, get down here. You need to see this. And bring the politician. I want to watch his face when he understands what we're fighting. The biolab was a sterile white bubble deep within the ship, a place of microscopes and genetic sequencers that felt alien to the Karen's grimy, functional aesthetic. On a central holographic display, a three-dimensional model of a swarm bioconstruct rotated slowly. It was a complex, nightmarish fusion of silicon, protein, and crystalline structures, all interwoven with a neural network that pulsed with a faint, captured light. The tissue sample they had risked everything to acquire. It's a masterpiece of biological engineering, Riley said, her eyes gleaming with a kind of horrified reverence. She pointed to a strand of what looked like glowing wire running through the model. This is its nervous system, but it's also its power conduit and its data bus. It's impossibly efficient. It doesn't just consume matter, it rewrites it at the molecular level. When it ate the Lumina, it learned to integrate their crystalline technology directly into its own biology. Valerius watched, his expression a mixture of fascination and revulsion. So, it becomes what it eats. It becomes better than what it eats, Riley corrected, But that's not the interesting part. The interesting part is how it grows. It's a cancer, a perfect weaponized cancer. Its replication process is flawless, but it's utterly dependent on its own signaling proteins to function. Without a constant go signal from the hive mind, the individual cells literally forget what they are and break down into inert sludge. That's what your resonance torpedo did, Elias. It didn't just shake them apart, it disrupted the psychic signal. You gave them all instantaneous, system-wide Alzheimer's. Thorn stared at the model, the pieces clicking into place in his mind. So if we can disrupt the signal, we can kill them without firing a shot. Not disrupt, Riley said, a grim smile playing on her lips. Hijack. I can synthesize a mimic virus, a biological agent designed to look like a swarm replication protein, but with a fatal flaw coded into it. A Trojan horse. It will spread through their system like a plague, and when the hive mind gives the order to replicate, to build a new ship or a new warrior, it will trigger our code instead. Instead of building, it will command them to dissolve. It would turn their own greatest strength, their interconnectedness, into a self-destruct mechanism. Valerius stepped back, his face ashen. A bioweapon. You want to commit xenocide. I want to survive, Thorn shot back, turning to face him. And survival is not a clean business. Your civilized methods would have us build a wall and wait to be eaten. I am offering a scalpel to cut out a tumor. You're talking about creating a plague, Valerius argued, his voice rising. Something that could mutate, that could spread beyond the swarm. You're playing God. The swarm already plays God, Thorn roared, his voice echoing in the sterile lab. It unmade a star system because it had the power to do so. Power is the only God in the void. Undersecretary, and I will use any power at my disposal to ensure that humanity is not erased from existence. Riley, how long to fabricate a viable strain? Riley was already back at her console. With our onboard fabricators and the resources from the fleet, I can produce enough to seed a single planet in 48 hours. Good, Thorn said, turning for the door. Begin production immediately. He paused, his hand on the panel, and looked back at Valerius. The undersecretary looked broken, a man of ideals drowning in a sea of brutal necessity. You came to me because you knew the Aegis Initiative was a fool's hope. You knew a monster was needed. You just didn't want to have to look it in the eye. Well, look, Mr. Valerius. This is the face of salvation. It is ugly. It is monstrous. But it is all we have. And with that, he left the lab, leaving Valerius alone with the ghost of a new plague and the crumbling ruins of his own morality. Thorn addressed the fleet from the bridge of the Karen, his scarred face broadcast to every vessel in the ghost Armada. He did not speak of hope or courage. He spoke of mathematics and extinction. He laid out the scorched void doctrine, not as a theory, but as a series of cold, hard orders. Their target was a chain of 5 uninhabited, resource-rich worlds designated the Anvil Cluster, which lay directly in the swarm's most likely path of advance. They would not merely destroy them, they would infect them. The fleet's heavy industrial fabricators were repurposed, churning out not munitions, but Riley's mimic virus. The plan was to deliver the agent via atmospheric torpedoes, seeding the planet's biospheres and crusts. The worlds themselves would become the weapon. When the swarm arrived to feed, they would consume the virus, absorbing the poison into the very heart of the hive mind. It was a strategy of profound, patient evil, and the crews of the Ghost Fleet received it not with cheers, but with a quiet, grim acceptance. This was the war they had been born to fight. 2 days later, they made the jump to the Anvil Cluster, The first target was Anvil 1, a rust-red world shrouded in a toxic methane atmosphere, rich in the heavy metals the swarm would need to replenish itself. The fleet took up a high orbit, and the grim work began. Specialized ships, retrofitted bombers, and heavy landers descended into the churning orange clouds to deploy their viral payloads. On the Karen's bridge, Kalen Reed oversaw the operation with his usual unnerving calm. Deployment is 70% complete on the primary continent. The virus is propagating through the native microbial life faster than projected. It was working. The trap was being set. And then the universe decided to remind them that no plan survives contact with the enemy. General, the tactical officer's voice was sharp with alarm. Massive subspace distortion at the edge of the system. It's not a warp signature. It's a tear. Something is coming through on the main view screen. A patch of space seemed to curdle. It shimmered, then darkened, and then ripped open like a wound, revealing a swirling, non-Euclidean vortex of sickly green and black energy. It was not a jump or a fold. The swarm didn't travel through space. They tore their way through it. From that festering wound in reality, the swarm fleet emerged. It was not the disorganized swarm of fighters they had fought at Cygnus. This was a war fleet. Dozens of the massive Maud cruisers led the way, flanked by hundreds of smaller, faster bioships that moved with a chilling, predatory purpose. They were no longer just a consuming horde. The psychic scream of the dying harvester had been more than a cry of pain. It had been a call to arms. The swarm was hunting them. "They're faster than we thought," Reed stated, a flicker of something almost like surprise in his voice. "They didn't follow the projected path. They tracked our fold signature. They came straight for us. All ships, recall your deployment craft," Thorne commanded, his mind racing. "Form a defensive line. Target their lead cruisers. I want our spinal mounts firing the second they are in range." But before the fleet could even fully reposition, a second alert, more chilling than the first, sliced through the bridge. Sir Moore Warp Signature's standard Confederate FTL. At the opposite edge of the system, it's the Aegis First Fleet. The flagship Invincible is leading. They're deploying into attack formation. Valerius stumbled onto the bridge, his face a mask of utter despair. He held a data slate displaying a message that had just been decrypted from his faction back on Earth. "They know. Council declared you warlord. Aegis Fleet ordered to destroy Ghost Fleet at all costs. Hostile intent confirmed. Sorry, they were trapped." In front of them, an alien hive mind bent on consuming all life, a force that had learned to hate them personally. Behind them, the full, righteous might of the Confederate Navy, sent to execute them for their treason. The trap they had so carefully laid for the swarm had snapped shut on them instead. Thorne stood on his bridge, the thrum of his warship a familiar comfort in a suddenly impossible situation. He looked at the tactical display, at the two massive, converging claws of a pincer movement designed by a cruel and unforgiving god. One fleet saw them as a disease to be purged. The other saw them as an infection to be eradicated. He took a deep breath, the cold, recycled air of his ship filling his lungs. A slow, terrible smile spread across his face. It was the smile of a cornered wolf. A smile that promised nothing but teeth and fury. "Helm," he said, his voice a low, predatory growl that filled the sudden silence of the bridge. "Bring us about. We're caught between the hammer and the anvil." He looked at the faces of his crew, at the hardened veterans who had followed him into hell before. "Let's remind them both," he declared, "why you don't corner a Death Worlder."